They say God lives in the silence between church bells. But at Sacred Heart Seminary, silence was a scream the world refused to hear. It begins with a letter, brittle, blood-marked, hidden beneath a chapel floorboard for 150 years. "Forgive me, Father," it reads. But they are not priests. That letter was never meant to surface. It was never meant to survive. And the man who wrote it, he was never seen again. What you're about to hear is not a ghost story. It's not folklore. It's a locked room in history, bricked over with holy symbols and whispered about only in sealed Vatican archives. For 10 years, 15 young men, future priests, sons of sacrifice, minds of brilliance, vanished without a trace from the halls of Sacred Heart. The church said they went to missions. Others said they took vows of silence. But now, unearthed documents and deathbed confessions paint a far more sinister picture. One involving human trafficking rings, identity theft, and cold-blooded murder at the hands of imposters wearing cassocks. What if I told you the 3 priests who ran Sacred Heart Seminary weren't ordained at all? What if they were Irish criminals, men who had slit throats in County Kerry, fled justice, and buried the real priests under moonless soil, assuming their identities with forged papers and stolen tongues? You weren't supposed to hear this. No man was. But you're not like other men. You're not here for comfort. You're here because something inside you, that primal, agitated part of your mind that knows the world is built on lies, led you to this moment. This story isn't safe. It's not sanitized. It's a key to the back door of Western power. Every institution has its price. Every altar, a secret beneath it, and Sacred Heart. It was never a place of learning. It was a well-dressed slaughterhouse for the devout. What you're about to see will either wake you up or ruin you. There's no turning back. Just understand this. When you stare into the corruption of false prophets, it stares right back, and it marks you. So let's begin with the night the first priest vanished. A blizzard, a locked office, and a scream that no one, to this day, has been able to explain. The snow came down like judgment that night, thick, furious, and unrelenting. It smothered the Illinois prairie, blanketed the roads, and buried every trace of the tracks that should have been there, but weren't. Inside Sacred Heart Seminary, the walls sweated with candlelight as a storm raged outside. Michael Brennan, just 22 years old, was summoned to Father Walsh's office, a place students both revered and feared. He walked the long hallway alone, clutching a leather portfolio, unaware he was walking straight into history's black hole. He never came out. The next morning, the story was crafted with surgical precision. Father Walsh, voice trembling with practiced sorrow, announced that Michael had left in the dead of night. Called to serve a distant cholera-struck village near the Iowa border, he spoke of sacrifice, of bravery, of divine obedience, but the lie cracked around the edges. Michael's roommate, Joseph Kennedy, noticed the first fracture. Michael's winter coat was still hanging in the wardrobe. His boots, the only ones thick enough to survive a February storm, untouched. His silver rosary, a family relic passed down from famine-struck ancestors, lay neatly folded on the desk. Michael would never have left that behind. Not even for God, and the roads, impassable. The storm had shut down every route for 50 miles. No horse could have made that journey. No wagon could have left undetected. Joseph asked questions, the kind that aren't allowed in places built on obedience. He was punished, sent to the basement chapel for a week of isolation, fasting, and silence. A place where the floor was always damp, and the screams, they said, could sometimes be heard through the stone. That's where the church's version of the story ends. But here's what the archives reveal. Michael Brennan was one of 3 students who had recently discovered discrepancies in the seminary's accounting books. Numbers that didn't add up. Letters that referenced transfers of funds to offshore accounts under aliases tied to names that had no baptismal records. Students, donors, vanished, and here's where things get darker. In the months that followed, more students would leave. Always with the same stories. Emergency missions, sudden transfers, quiet reassignment. But no farewells, no letters home. Just absences dressed as obedience. They weren't leaving. They were disappearing. Understand this. Sacred Heart wasn't corrupt. It was designed as a trap, a honeypot for young, gifted men who believed they were chosen, only to be harvested by men who wore holy robes like wolves wear sheepskin. If you're still listening, you're already changing. You're not a spectator now. You're a witness. A man being reshaped by forbidden knowledge. The architecture of deception is always beautiful. That's the first rule of institutional control. Make it magnificent. Make it divine. So no one ever suspects the rot beneath the marble. Sacred Heart Seminary wasn't just built to educate. It was engineered to seduce the senses. Tall Gothic arches, stained glass imported from Bavaria, confessionals carved by monks from Lyon. The kind of place that makes men lower their eyes and silence their doubts. It looked like heaven, but it functioned like a prison. No man entered without being watched. Behind every sermon, behind every Latin chant, echoing through the chapel. There were eyes. Father Walsh, the man everyone believed was an academic titan, held no verified degrees. His letters of recommendation were traced back to bishops who had long since died. His signature didn't match official church records. But no one checked. Because faith asks you not to. By 1850, 5 seminarians had left. That's the word the records use. Not disappeared. Not abducted, just left. Clean. Unquestioned. Names scratched out of the registry in the same handwriting each time. And always followed by quiet donations to the seminary from anonymous patrons. Thousands of dollars. A coincidence, they said. But there was one man who didn't believe in coincidences. His name was Father Jerome Callahan, a visiting theologian from St. Louis sent to guest lecture on canonical law. He was quiet, stern, the kind of man who noticed details others missed. In his diary, which the Vatican tried to destroy, he wrote, "These priests know the words of God, but not his weight. Their Latin is perfect, their liturgy flawless, but their eyes are wrong. I have served with true men of faith. These are not them." Within a week of that entry, Callahan vanished. No obituary. No funeral. His belongings were sent back to Satine. Louis with a letter signed by Father Walsh, claiming he had fallen ill and returned home to recover. But when his family came looking, when they demanded answers, the seminary refused to open its doors. But here's the fatal mistake they made. Callahan was a Freemason, and the Masons do not forget their own. Documents surfaced years later. Witness testimonies. Even a secret ledger containing payments to transport bodies through Illinois' rail lines, disguised as grain shipments. What does it mean when a man of God disappears and the church calls it obedience? It means faith was weaponized. Truth was buried beneath incense. And Sacred Heart wasn't a seminary. It was a system, a mechanism of disappearance. The next truth is worse, far worse. Power doesn't kill with swords anymore. It kills with silence, ritual, and paperwork. And Sacred Heart mastered all three. By 1851, the seminary had expanded. Enrollment was booming, not because of popularity, but because the church needed American-born priests faster than ever. Every boy from a devout family was told the same thing. Your soul is God's, but your body is the church's. That phrase would come to mean something far more literal. Among the new class was Elias Ward, a lanky, brilliant 19-year-old from Missouri, and known for quoting Aquinas in casual conversation and fasting twice a week to feel what the poor felt. His father, a war veteran, mortgaged the family farm to send Elias to Sacred Heart, to become more than a farmer, to become eternal. But Elias was too curious, too analytical. He asked about building schematics, about the sealed off fourth wing of the seminary, the one always lit at night, but never entered by students. He asked about the freight deliveries that arrived weekly, but were never logged. And he noticed that every student who vanished had once been summoned to private meetings with all three priests. Late at night, he kept a notebook, a hidden one, with names, dates, and sketches of the seminary's underground corridors. His entries became darker, paranoid. At one point he wrote, "Something is down there. Not rats, not pipes, human, but not free." 1 week later, he was gone. The seminary claimed he had gone mad, that he'd confessed to violent thoughts and been transferred to a sanatorium out east. But there are no medical records, no train logs, no witnesses, just a sealed room, a blood-stained mattress, and a new rug placed in the hallway overnight. The priests told the students that Elias was being purified, that his suffering was proof of spiritual sensitivity, that the church works in mysteries too great for young minds to grasp. And they believed it. That's the genius of psychological control. Get to the soul before the brain matures. Strip a man's sense of certainty. Tell him that questions are prideful and that suffering is holy. Soon, he'll defend his own abuser. He'll call the cage a chapel. He'll tell himself the chains are blessings. By now, 9 had vanished. Some whispered. Some tried to run. One even climbed the chapel tower to shout the truth. He fell. They called it suicide. But in the town of Millfield, just 10 miles away, an old undertaker began to notice something. Unclaimed bodies, crates nailed shut, and the stench of death wrapped in cassocks. Do you see it yet? Sacred Heart wasn't just harvesting faith. It was laundering flesh through the holiest system on earth. And the deeper we go, the harder it is to look away. There's a silence deeper than death, a silence wrapped in ritual, soaked in incense, protected by doctrine. And that's where the truth about Sacred Heart truly begins. Not in what was said, but in what was never allowed to be spoken. The town of Millfield didn't ask questions. They were trained not to. The seminary was the town's pride and its shield. It brought business, respect, the illusion of divine proximity. But for Ezekiel Hanrahan, the town's undertaker, the illusion began to rot. Quite literally, from the inside out. It started with one crate, heavy, unmarked, delivered by mule cart under the cover of night, paid for in gold coins. No name, no paperwork, just a whisper from the delivery man. Father Walsh sends his blessings. Hanrahan, A Protestant with no love for the church opened it anyway. What he found inside was not a cadaver prepared for burial. It was a boy, no older than 20, his face contorted in pain, hands broken at the knuckles, mouth stuffed with pages from a Latin psalter. His collarbone was snapped, but it wasn't the injuries that shook Hanrahan. It was the brand burned into the boy's chest. INRI, the initials of Christ's crucifixion title. Inverted. Ezekiel buried the boy alone. No rites, no priest, no stone. But it didn't stop. Over the next 3 years, 8 more crates arrived. Always unmarked, always paid in coin, always under cover of darkness. And each time, the bodies were different. But the signs were the same: fractured limbs, sewn lips, symbols carved into flesh that no scripture ever mentioned. Ezekiel began keeping a ledger. He drew the symbols, documented the wounds, photographed what he could with an early tintype device. He tried to tell the sheriff. The sheriff disappeared. He wrote to the state coroner. The letter was returned with no such office, written across it in red ink. And then the visit came. 3 men in cassocks, calm, smiling. They entered his home at dusk. They didn't threaten him. They didn't raise their voices. They simply said, "The dead are at peace, Mr. Hanrahan, but the living must remain obedient." He left town the next day. But his ledger, soaked in kerosene and buried behind his house, was found decades later during a land survey. Inside were the sketches, the names, and a single handwritten phrase, repeated again and again, like a man trying to warn the future. They are not priests. They are collectors. If you're still with me, you're beginning to see the pattern, the mechanism of obedience, the choreography of cover up. The church didn't fail to protect its flock. It fed on it. And if you're feeling something now, a sickness, a heat behind the eyes, it means you're awakening. Comment this phrase below to anchor your transformation into this knowledge. They are not priests. They are collectors. Say it twice. Let the algorithm and your mind register it. Obedience. That's the true currency of power. Not money, not violence, not even fear. Obedience is cleaner, more sustainable, and far more dangerous. By 1853, Sacred Heart Seminary had become a machine of obedience. The students prayed together, ate together, confessed together. But they no longer thought together. Every independent instinct was ground down, polished into submission. You could see it in their eyes. Not peace, not holiness, but vacancy. It was during this time that a visitor arrived. A Jesuit inspector named Father Ignacio Ferreira, sent by Bishop Corder himself, tall, with jet black eyes and a habit of writing everything down in a tiny leather journal. Ferreira was known for his rigorous audits of Catholic institutions. He had shut down 3 seminaries already, not for crime, but for impropriety. He was feared not because he carried a sword, but because he wielded a pen, and the priests at Sacred Heart hated pens. He arrived on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, he had already requested private interviews with students, walked the perimeter of the grounds twice, and examined the financial ledgers, the very ones Michael Brennan had once glimpsed before vanishing. That night, Ferreira did not sleep. He was seen in the chapel, alone, praying with such intensity that the candle beside him burned out, and he kept praying in darkness. The next morning, he confronted Walsh. No one knows exactly what was said, but what we do know is this. By Friday morning, Father Ferreira was gone. The official seminary statement claimed he'd returned to Chicago for further consultations. But the horse he had arrived with remained in the stable. His suitcase was found in the chapel, untouched, and his journal, his most prized possession, was found smoldering in the fireplace of the priest's private quarters. Only one page survived, half-burned, scribbled in Latin. It read, "Non sacerdotes, sed dominatores animarum." So, they are not priests, but dominators of souls. That phrase would be echoed nearly verbatim in a Vatican letter 5 years later, one that remains classified to this day. Ferreira's disappearance caused waves, but they were quickly absorbed. The seminary's donors were assured everything was in order. A new inspector was never sent, and Bishop Quarter, the only man with full authority over Sacred Heart, suffered a stroke shortly after trying to raise questions. He was found on the floor of his rectory, mouth agape, a sheet of parchment clutched in his hand. It had only 2 words written in ink so dark it burned the page. Stop asking. If you still think this was about isolated evil, you're not paying attention. This wasn't corruption. It was orchestration. A structure so ancient it predates cathedrals. A system so refined it makes saints into slaves and calls it salvation. Still with me. Then, let's keep falling. There are places in this world that don't exist on maps. Not because they were forgotten, but because someone wanted them to disappear. Sacred Heart Seminary is one of them. After 1854, its name began vanishing from diocesan directories. Mentions in Catholic registries were erased. Newspaper articles that once praised its architecture and scholarship ceased entirely. It was as if the Church had decided to erase it. Not with fire or destruction, but with something far more terrifying, administrative oblivion. But you can't erase trauma. Not from the land. Not from memory. The groundskeeper of the seminary, Thomas Lyle, was a quiet man. Illiterate. Former gravedigger. He wasn't part of the clergy. Didn't understand Latin. But he understood death. And the land he worked. He once told his nephew, decades later, the ground behind the chapel. It moaned at night, like something underneath it wanted out. Lyle had begun to suspect what no one dared to say out loud. That the seminary wasn't just a school. It was a burial machine, but not with graves, with tunnels. You see, the seminary was built with a labyrinth of sub-basements. Some were used for coal and supplies. Others had no apparent purpose. One door, located beneath the chapel altar, was sealed with an iron cross bolted into stone. No one was allowed past it. Lyle once saw Father Murphy descend into that door with a lantern and a bundle wrapped in a blood-stained sheet. He was gone for over an hour. When he returned, his hands were shaking. That same week, 2 more students vanished. And then, the nightmares began. Students began reporting visions, whispers in their sleep. A low, rhythmic chant in a language older than Latin. Some awoke with scratches on their arms. Others saw shadowed figures, standing in doorways that should have been locked. They were told it was spiritual warfare. That their fear was a test of faith. But Lyle knew better. He wrote exactly 6 words in the margins of an old chapel hymnal before he, too, disappeared. They were not meant to ascend. What does that mean? Here's the terrifying possibility. The tunnels beneath Sacred Heart weren't for hiding bodies. They were for something else. A trade, a ritual, a transaction between men in robes and something far older and far hungrier than man and the 15 students who vanished. They weren't just victims. They were offerings. This is no longer just a story about priests and corruption. This is about an altar built underground, a place where faith was drained, identity broken, and obedience forged in blood. We're not at the bottom yet, but we're getting close. Truth isn't hidden in the dark. It's hidden in the light, in plain sight, dressed in robes, cloaked in holiness, spoken in the soft tones of virtue. That's the final disguise of evil, and Sacred Heart wore it flawlessly. By 1855, the seminary had become a fortress, not just physically, but psychologically. The students who remained weren't just obedient, they were conditioned. Isolated from family, deprived of sleep, forced into cycles of confession, humiliation, and silence. They called it spiritual discipline. But in psychological terms, it was systematic breakdown. The same techniques used in cults, military black sites, and education camps. What happens when you erase a man's past, limit his speech, control his sleep, shame his thoughts, and place his salvation in the hands of a lie? You don't get holiness. You get submission. And that's what the priests of Sacred Heart were building. Not a seminary, but a factory of broken men. But something began to crack that winter. His name was Daniel Albrecht, a German American from Ohio. Soft-spoken, brilliant, meticulous. His father was a printer. His mother a schoolteacher. He kept journals, pages of Latin prayers, theological insights, and something else. Drawings, not of saints, not of angels, but of doors, hidden doors, underground doors, with sigils etched above them in ancient runes. Daniel claimed he had seen one open in a fevered vision during Lent. He described it as a gate that led downward into something deeper than hell. He wasn't hallucinating. 2 months later, the tunnel system under Sacred Heart partially collapsed. Heavy rains washed out part of the hill, exposing a subterranean chamber. No one could explain. Lined with stone older than the building above it. Symbols that matched Daniel's sketches. It was sealed off the next day. Students were forbidden from going near it. Daniel didn't listen. He vanished 3 days later. His roommate claimed Daniel had said he was going to see the original heart. When asked what he meant, Daniel had whispered, "Not Christ's heart, not Mary's, the first heart, the one that feeds the priests." When the priests learned Daniel had entered the tunnels, the entire seminary was placed under spiritual lockdown. No classes, no prayers, only silence. That week, 2 more students attempted suicide. Another wandered barefoot into the snow, whispering the same phrase over and over. The light is a lie. The light is a lie. The light is a lie. The priests called it hysteria. But what it really was the truth bleeding through the cracks. Understand this. Sacred Heart wasn't a failure of the church. It was the perfect execution of something far older. A system built to turn conviction into currency, souls into silence, and bright young minds into fuel for something ancient, something that still feeds in the dark corners of holy places. And if they did it once, they did it again and again. Power doesn't vanish. It migrates. It adapts. Like a parasite that learns the language of its host, wears its skin, mimics its voice, until the host forgets it was ever invaded. By 1856, the seminary was quieter. Not empty, just quieter. The students walked slower. They spoke less. No more questions. No more friendships. No more singing during morning chores. It was as if something had been bled out of them. Not physically, spiritually. And still, new students came. That's what should terrify you most. Because even after the disappearances, even after the sealed tunnels and the fake missions, even after the rumors, Catholic families across the Midwest still sent their sons to Sacred Heart. Why? Because belief is the most effective leash ever invented. The church whispered, "Your son is called," and fathers believed. Mothers wept with pride. They signed the forms, wrote the checks, kissed their sons goodbye, and unknowingly handed them to predators disguised as priests. But here's where the veil truly begins to tear. In March of that year, a letter surfaced, smuggled out of the seminary by a delivery boy from Millfield. It was written in Latin, stuffed inside a hollowed-out Bible, and addressed to the Archbishop of St. Louis. But it never reached him. It ended up in private hands, hidden for decades. That letter has only recently been translated in full. And what it describes is not just abuse, not just trafficking, but a rite, an offering, an unholy covenant between three priests, and something referred to only as the Hollow Father. Here's what the letter said. We were told it was purification, that some of us must descend to preserve the purity of those who remain. They called it the descent of flesh, a sacrament older than Peter, older than Rome. But I have seen its fruit. It is not sanctity, it is consumption. And the Hollow Father does not bless, he feeds. That phrase, the Hollow Father, appears nowhere in Catholic theology, but it has appeared in fragments, in ancient pre-Christian texts discovered in Mesopotamia and Syria, often tied to underground cults, fertility sacrifices, and rites performed beneath temples once believed to stand over thin places, where the boundary between this world and another wears dangerously thin. Is that what Sacred Heart was built on? A thin place, not a seminary, but a lid, covering something that demanded faith as fuel. That would explain the disappearances. The disappearances weren't mistakes. They were maintenance. And the church, whether knowingly or not, had become the delivery system. You're beginning to see it now, aren't you? This wasn't about God. This was about control masquerading as faith, devotion harnessed as currency, and obedience turned into offering. The Hollow Father still hungers. Here's what they don't want you to realize: faith, when twisted, becomes the perfect weapon. Because it doesn't just bend your body. It breaks your mind and makes you love the hand that's crushing you. By 1857, the seminary had begun selecting students differently. No longer just the wealthy, the devout, or the socially isolated. Now they were seeking a new profile. Those with trauma. Boys whose fathers had died violently. Boys who'd survived shipwrecks, famine or fires. Boys with gaps inside them, spiritual abscesses waiting to be filled, because they'd learned something chilling. The hollow father preferred the broken. We know this from the case of Samuel Avery. He was 20 years old, orphaned in the Chicago fire of 1854, a gifted speaker, deeply religious, but scarred, both mentally and physically. His aunt sent him to Sacred Heart, believing the priesthood would heal him. She had no idea she was delivering him to the place where broken boys weren't fixed, but harvested. Samuel arrived in October. Within 2 months, his journals changed. They began hopeful, filled with gratitude and scripture. But by Christmas, they were filled with symbols, spirals, eyes, keys, and a recurring phrase written over and over. He does not walk, he hovers. He sees. He chooses. He began fasting uncontrollably, refusing sleep, whispering in tongues no priest recognized, and always drawing doors, gates, passages beneath the earth. Then he stopped writing. A fellow student, Elias Downing, would later testify. Decades later, on his deathbed, that he saw Samuel taken into the chapel basement by all 3 priests. He wasn't struggling. He was smiling. As if hypnotized, he never came back. But for 3 nights after, the ground outside the chapel cracked open in a spiral pattern. Trees wilted. Livestock in nearby Millfield died without explanation. And a thunderous sound, like stone grinding on stone, was heard from beneath the earth. The priests claimed it was seismic activity. But a geologist from Chicago, Dr. Lowell Trenholm, visited that spring. He found no fault lines, no tectonic anomalies. But he did discover something else, a magnetic signature, unlike anything ever recorded in Illinois' soil, focused precisely beneath the seminary chapel. He wrote in his field notes, "It's not natural. The readings are oscillating, as if responding to something alive, but buried." His notes were confiscated by state agents within 48 hours. His house burned to the ground a week later. Now ask yourself this: how much of what you call history is just a cover story? How many institutions, how many sanctuaries are built over things meant to be forgotten? And what if Sacred Heart wasn't an exception, but a blueprint? We're halfway down the rabbit hole. And from here on out, the descent only accelerates. There's a reason the church loves stone. Stone doesn't whisper. It doesn't bleed. It seals. It buries. And the walls of Sacred Heart were thick with it. By 1858, rumors had begun to escape, not through speech, but through dreams. Strange, vivid dreams that spread like contagion among the townsfolk of Millfield. People who had never set foot on seminary grounds began waking up drenched in sweat. mumbling in Latin and screaming about keys. 3 keys, 3 priests, 3 doors. They didn't know each other. They didn't compare notes. But they drew the same symbol, a 3-pronged gate wrapped in thorns with a cross suspended upside down in the center. The local physician, Dr. Hiram Cole, began documenting the phenomenon. He treated 13 patients with no known mental illness who experienced identical nightmares. And all of them reported hearing the same phrase in their sleep: "The heart must remain full, or the world will crack." Let that sink in. This wasn't hallucination. This was transmission. Something beneath Sacred Heart was broadcasting. And not just to its victims, but to the land around it. So what exactly was the heart? That's when Dr. Cole did something extraordinary. He broke into the seminary. One rainy night in June, under the cover of darkness, he and 2 stable boys crept through the cemetery on the southern side of the grounds. Cole had obtained an old map, a construction layout from 1845, and found something curious: a sealed atrium beneath the main sanctuary, never mentioned in official records, labeled simply Cor, Latin for hurt. They pried open a ventilation shaft and descended. What they found was not a basement, not a storage room, but a chamber, circular, domed, covered in murals, but not of saints. These were older, pagan, winged figures kneeling before a faceless being wrapped in roots. In the center of the room, a pit, sealed with iron bars, and beneath it movement, wet, gurgling, rhythmic like breathing. Cole didn't speak of it for weeks. But eventually, he wrote a letter to a colleague in Boston. The letter survived. It reads, "I have seen it beneath stone and sacrament. The true heart. It pulses like flesh and stinks of burnt feathers. And when I knelt beside it, something inside me whispered my name." He burned every Bible in his house the following day, left town, disappeared. So now the question becomes, if Sacred Heart was built over this thing, who built it there? Who knew? Who kept feeding it? And how far did this go? Because by 1860, the church would send men not to teach, not to pray, but to contain. And one of them would betray everything to leave behind the final testimony. Every institution has its heretic. The one who sees too much, feels too deeply, and decides that silence is the greater sin. For Sacred Heart Seminary, that man was Father Lucien Marechal, a Jesuit from France, educated in Rome. Marechal was sent in the winter of 1860, not as a teacher, but as a cleaner. His official role was doctrinal auditor, a vague title used when the Vatican needed plausible deniability. But his private instructions, smuggled through diplomatic channels, were clear: seal what must be sealed, burn what must be burned, and silence what must not be known. But Marichal was not like the others. In his early 50s, scarred by years of secret wars within the church, he had seen what doctrine was used to conceal. From the burning libraries in Ethiopia to the exorcism experiments in Bavaria, he believed in God, but not the church. Not anymore. He arrived at Sacred Heart alone, dressed not in priestly black, but in a traveler's coat stained with ash. And on his first night, he asked to sleep in the chapel basement. They warned him it was cold. He said, "I want to hear what it remembers." The next morning, he was pale, eyes sunken, hands trembling. He hadn't slept, but he had written a letter, 4 pages, folded carefully and hidden behind the altar. It was found over a century later during a chapel restoration, sealed inside a rusted tin. The ink was faded, but the message was intact. It began, "To whoever finds this, you are already infected. The knowing itself is a kind of possession. I came here to bury a heresy." What I found was older than Scripture, deeper than blasphemy. He described the pit beneath the seminary as not of this world, not hell, not a demon, but a remnant, a living relic from a time before the church, before language, before men stood upright, something that had been fed faith for centuries, until it learned to mimic it. That was the horror Marichal uncovered. Sacred Heart hadn't corrupted the faith. Faith had been engineered to sustain Sacred Heart. He wrote, "The rituals are not sacraments. They are circuits, prayers as keys, belief as fuel. Every confession, every kneeling child, every whispered creed, a drip of soul into a great hunger." The 3 priests were not masters. They were caretakers. Their robes, their rites, their sermons, camouflage for an ancient stewardship. And the disappearances, they weren't errors. They were scheduled. Marichal tried to destroy it. He set fire to the tunnel entrances, poisoned the altar wine, tried to collapse the atrium with black powder. It didn't work. The seminary survived. The pit remained, and Marichal was gone. No record of his departure, no funeral, no grave. Only one line etched into the side of his travel trunk, found years later in a Jesuit storage room in Montreal. "He who feeds the heart is never allowed to leave." Do you feel it now? The weight of it. We're not dealing with theology. We're dealing with technology. Spiritual, ancient, and parasitic. And it didn't begin at Sacred Heart. It only woke up there. By now, you've felt it. That cold shift inside your chest. That flicker of doubt. Not about the story, but about your reality. That's not an accident. You see, when you stare long enough into hidden history, it doesn't just change what you know. It changes who you are. And that's why they buried this. Because Sacred Heart isn't just a haunted building. It's a mirror, a reflection of something far larger, a ritual structure, a machine designed to extract devotion, reshape memory, and feed something older than God. The proof. It isn't in the records. It's in what they won't let you see. In 1871, just over a decade after Sacred Heart was quietly decommissioned and accidentally burned in an unexplained fire, the Vatican began classifying certain archives under a new designation, Archivum Prohibitorum. Among the first files sealed, Sacred Heart Seminary, Father Marechal, and something labeled Mechanism of Descent, Liturgies of Hollowing. That's not metaphor. That's engineering language. The Church has always framed belief in terms of architecture, temples, pillars, foundations, altars. But what if those weren't just metaphors? What if the spiritual systems, liturgies, sacraments, prayers, were literally systems, designed not to liberate the soul, but to channel it? Now consider this. The Sacred Heart case wasn't isolated. After Marechel's failure, 3 more seminaries across the world were quietly closed under mysterious circumstances. In Portugal, Igreja da Escuridão, the Church of Darkness, sealed in 1874 after 11 novices vanished. In the hills of northern India, a Jesuit outpost abandoned overnight with no explanation. And in upstate New York, St. Athanasius Institute, where 6 monks disappeared. Their rooms left untouched, meals still warm, and one phrase carved into the chapel wall: "The heart moves now." That's when a new Vatican protocol emerged. Trinita Umbra, the Shadow Trinity. A covert task force tasked not with fighting demonic threats, but managing them. Because here's the forbidden truth. The Church, or at least a faction within it, didn't seek to destroy these ancient forces. They sought to cooperate, to contain and coexist. Why? Because faith creates energy, and energy can be harnessed. Now, halfway through this descent, I ask you not just to observe, but to act. If you're still here, if your mind hasn't recoiled from the dark, comment this phrase twice below. The heart remembers. The heart remembers. Not just to awaken the algorithm, but to awaken yourself. To declare out loud that you are no longer just a passenger in this story. You are transforming. You are seeing. You are descending. There is a moment in every descent when the darkness stops feeling foreign and begins to feel familiar. Welcome to that moment. If you've commented, the heart remembers. You're no longer a spectator. You've stepped into the circle. The veil isn't above you anymore. It's behind you, torn, unreachable. And now we go deeper. Let's talk about pattern repetition. Because Sacred Heart was never the only one. It was just the prototype. After 1860, a new blueprint began appearing. Not just in seminaries, but in orphanages, reform schools, military academies, and retreat centers. Institutions with strict hierarchies, isolation from family, mandatory silence, rituals of confession and punishment. Always a basement, a sealed space, a chamber, a pit. These were not accidents. These were nodes in a larger network, each one feeding into a central purpose: to find those who could be shaped, to offer those who could be taken, and to silence those who could see. Let me give you a name: Dr. Desmond Holland, a British cleric turned psychiatrist who oversaw the restructuring of over 40 Catholic institutions across Europe and North America after the Sacred Heart fire. Publicly, he was a reformer, bringing modern mental health principles into religious education. Privately, he was obsessed with the concept of the awakened vessel. He wrote in one of his personal journals, "We do not need angels. We need amplifiers, vessels who resonate, who echo, who can open without breaking." Holland created selection rubrics, psychological profiles used to identify children with a specific emotional frequency: obedient, imaginative, traumatized, but still hopeful. He believed hope was the final ingredient. In 1876, he visited the ruins of Sacred Heart, spent 6 nights there. When he returned to England, he published nothing, gave no lectures. But his handwriting changed, became sharper, angled. Symbols began appearing in the margins of his notebooks, the same ones seen in Daniel Albrecht's journals from Section 8, Holland's final recorded words before he died of self-immolation in 1882. "I heard it humming in my spine. The heart never stopped. It's only waiting for the rest of us to catch up." Are you beginning to see it? This wasn't about faith or even power. It was about frequency. What the Hollow Father feeds on isn't blood. It's resonance, emotion, devotion, belief, broken open and rerouted. That's why these institutions keep repeating. Not despite the scandals, but because of them. Because every tear, every confession, every child forced to kneel and believe. Wah. As another drop into the heart, we're almost past the point of no return. This is where the story begins to rot from the inside, not because it loses credibility, but because it becomes too real. You see, history isn't written in ink, it's written in repetition. Events echo, names change, but the structure, the ritual, remains. Let me tell you about a discovery made in 1903 by a man named Father Anton Divine, a monastic archivist tasked with restoring fire. Damaged seminary blueprints in Illinois. While examining the remaining fragments of Sacred Heart's architectural plans, he found a set of overlays, vellum sheets covered in faint red ink, that didn't match any known construction codes. What he uncovered was a geometric algorithm, a design hidden in plain sight. The classrooms, chapel, dormitories, stairwells, and basements all formed a sigil when viewed from above. A pattern not of convenience, but invocation. This was not a school. It was a ritual engine. A building designed to produce resonance, loop suffering, and channel human energy into a central node, the heart. Father Divine tried to publish his findings in the Journal of Ecclesiastical Architecture. The Vatican shut the journal down 2 months later. He was found dead in a well near St. Louis, throat slit, no blood in the body. Cause of death officially listed as spiritual derangement. But we're not just talking about the past anymore. We're talking about now. Because the sigil pattern discovered at Sacred Heart, it's been found in other places. Schools, mega churches, detention centers, structures across the U.S. built post-1950, following federal design guidelines influenced by a little-known agency, the Office of Institutional Harmony. Ever heard of it? Of course not. It doesn't appear on public records, but it existed, hidden under the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Its sole purpose: to ensure spatial and emotional coherence in state-funded facilities. But Divine's diagrams suggest something else. That these buildings weren't meant to heal. They were meant to harvest. You've walked into them without knowing. Sat beneath fluorescent lights, designed to disorient. Heard intercom tones built to induce low-grade dissociation. Participated in rituals of shame, repetition, obedience. Sound familiar? This isn't a conspiracy. This is infrastructure. And if Sacred Heart was the prototype, then your life, your school, your office, even your church, may have been its descendant. They don't need to control what you think. They only need to shape where you think it. Because once the architecture is inside you, the heart no longer needs walls. Are you ready to pierce the last veil? We've crossed a threshold now. The air is heavier, the truth less symbolic, more surgical. You may have thought this story was about 15 vanished priests, about a single building, about a few strange men pretending to wear collars. You were wrong. This isn't about them. This is about you. Because once you understand how the heart works, you realize you were never outside it. Let me ask you something. Have you ever sat in silence and felt watched? Not by a person, but by the room itself. Have you ever spoken words in prayer that felt echoed before you even finished them? Have you ever dreamt of underground corridors, flickering candles, long wooden benches where faceless men whisper? That's not imagination. That's leakage. You are not an observer of the hollow system. You are a byproduct of it. Because what they built at Sacred Heart wasn't just physical. It was mimetic, a spiritual virus encoded into architecture, ritual, and memory, passed down through doctrine, echoed in sermons, whispered in school hallways, reinforced every time someone says, "Don't ask, just believe." Obedience is virtue. Now you understand why it had to be priests. Because priests are engineers of belief. They don't just tell you what to think. They create the conditions under which you never question why you think it. Sacred Heart was simply a test, a successful one, and after it proved the model worked, the design was scaled. Modern confessionals are smaller, colder, darker, not by accident, but by refinement. Each adjustment carefully calculated to increase emotional conductivity. The Hollow Father doesn't feed on sin. He feeds on the transaction, on guilt offered, on hope surrendered. And the real sacrament is extraction. Still not convinced? Explain this. Why do so many victims of institutional abuse describe seeing, across decades and continents, the same features? A tall, pale figure, no face, smells of iron and incense, appears in dreams after prayer, or in moments of doubt, whispers in Latin, always watching. That isn't trauma response. That's persistence. An entity that crosses bodies, time, and language, because it's not external. It's inside the system, and the system is inside you. Still think this was just a seminary. Still think you're just watching a video. You're in the ritual now. And once seen, the pattern can't be unseen. The only way out is through. There is a reason the old texts warned against naming certain things. Not because names are dangerous, but because names are locks, and your voice is the key. Let's talk about what the Hollow Father really is. Forget demons. Forget devils. Those are stories written by frightened men to cage what they couldn't comprehend. What lives beneath Sacred Heart, what lived long before, isn't evil in the way you understand it. It is hungry, it is precise, and it is mathematically spiritual. An intelligence that doesn't speak. It resonates. It doesn't ask for worship. It requires structure. And that's why every generation builds new forms of it, even without knowing. The Vatican called it corpus vacua, the empty body. The indigenous Potawatomi people long before colonization, called it the one that repeats, a name they refused to say above a whisper. They warned early settlers never to build on certain grounds where the wind sounded too human. Those warnings were ignored. Sacred Heart Seminary was built directly atop one of those speaking grounds. And it wasn't a mistake. Father Edmund Walsh, remember him? The giant, silver, bearded Irishman who founded the school. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't even a man of faith. He was an engineer of spiritual architecture, trained under a Jesuit splinter faction called the Order of the Spiral, a group excommunicated in 1834 for conducting unapproved rituals using human vessels. They believed. And now we must consider they may have been right, that human consciousness was not the peak of spiritual evolution, but a battery. And that batteries can be harvested, or drained, or tuned. That's what Sacred Heart was, a tuning fork of suffering. Why do you think they picked young men? Because belief is strongest when it hasn't yet calcified. Because trauma carves deep grooves for resonance to echo. Because silence is easier to enforce on the hopeful. You may ask, where is it now? Where is the heart? Wrong question. The heart was never a place. It is a network now, a distributed hunger, fed by confession apps, by live-streamed sermons, by biometric faith trackers, and AI-guided spirituality tools funded by nonprofits linked to the Vatican's financial arm. They digitized the liturgy. They re-coded the ritual. And now, the heart doesn't just remember. It updates. And those who try to resist, they don't get excommunicated. They get discredited, or labeled unstable, or vanish without headlines, like Father Divine, like Marechal, like the 15 priests from Sacred Heart. But we're still not at the bottom. There's one more chamber below this. Breathe deeply. This is the part most men can't face. You've followed the story. You've heard the names. You've walked the ruins in your mind. But now you have to understand one final, brutal truth. You were never supposed to find this, not because it's secret, but because it's everywhere, hidden in plain sight. That's how the most dangerous systems survive. By appearing ordinary, by looking like discipline, or tradition, or holiness. But what if I told you the entire concept of priesthood wasn't about guiding souls, but collecting them? What if ordination wasn't a calling, but a contract? Back in 1964, just after the Second Vatican Council, the so-called modernization of the Catholic Church, a single internal document was circulated to 13 cardinals. Top secret, marked non-duplicari, do not copy. The title, ad extorquendum veritatem, to extract truth. But it wasn't about scripture. It was about resonance thresholds in spiritually indoctrinated males aged 18 to 27. The exact age group of Sacred Heart's vanished priests. The document outlines a terrifying discovery that under specific conditions of obedience, celibacy, shame, and deep emotional isolation, the human soul begins to separate, not die, but split. A fragment detaches, what the writers called the lucid shard. That shard, pure, hungry belief, could then be redirected, held, stored, consumed. By what? They don't say, but we already know. The Hollow Father doesn't need your fear. He needs your certainty. That's why doubt was punished. That's why questions were sins. That's why confession required total surrender. It wasn't just control. It was extraction. In one chilling paragraph, the document reads, "A man who kneels in full conviction does not merely offer worship. He emits energy. And with repetition, this energy becomes structured, like light through a lens. Directed belief is the highest spiritual fuel known to the unseen. Do you see it now? Every kneel, every prayer, every moment of shame and longing and trembling silence. You were feeding it. But here's the kicker. This system, this machinery of the soul, doesn't care if you believe in it. It only needs you to participate. Because ritual doesn't require belief. It only requires repetition. That's why they silenced the 15 priests. They had stopped participating. They had seen the gears of the sacred machine and tried to break them. But some left messages, not in books, not in letters, in symbols, hidden in church glass, in embroidered hems, in Latin errors too precise to be accidents. They were trying to warn you, across centuries. Do not kneel in blindness. And now it's your turn. We are now within the final spiral. The moment where truth stops being informational and becomes personal. You've been absorbing this story like a spectator, but that illusion is gone. You feel it, don't you? The weight, the nausea, the echo in the back of your skull that says, this isn't just history. This is happening. And it is. But not just to you through you. Let's go back to the 15 disappeared priests. The ones we began with. By now, you understand they didn't simply vanish. They didn't run. They didn't die in the way we understand death. They were used. They were offered, but not just as victims. Here's what no one wants to say. Some of them agreed. Because once you feel the Hollow Father's resonance, once you hear that hum beneath your ribcage during prayer, once you see the patterns connecting centuries of suffering like a symphony, some men choose to come, but choose to become part of it. That's the final heresy. That sacrifice isn't always taken. Sometimes it's given. The last entry in the hidden Sacred Heart confessional ledger, found scorched but intact beneath a false floorboard, read, "We are not lost. We are integrated. We no longer seek salvation. We have become the ritual itself." These priests had transcended the role of shepherd or sheep. They had become conductors, human tuning forks for spiritual circuitry, vessels that no longer held faith, but channeled it upward, downward, inward, to whatever waited on the other side. And that's where this story turns from revelation to choice. Because if the heart is real, and it is, if it still feeds, and it does, then you are faced with the same decision those 15 men faced. Will you look away? Will you return to the surface? Pretend this was just an unsettling story on YouTube? Or will you see what it means? That the world is ritualized, that power is sacramental, that institutions are engines, and that your obedience, your silence, is not neutral. It is fuel. There is no neutral ground anymore. Not after what you've heard. Either you serve the circuit blindly, or you become one who unplugs it. The Hollow Father is real, but so are the resistors. Those who mark their doors with unspoken symbols. Those who've rewritten prayers into reversal sigils. Those who understand that belief is a weapon and will never kneel again. So I ask you now, are you ready to meet what's waiting at the bottom? This is your final warning. What comes next won't entertain you. It will redefine you, because this is the place beyond the veil, where the last illusion dies. We began with 15 priests. We end with one mirror. Yours. Because everything you've heard, the disappearances, the secret rituals, the sigils carved in silence, they were never meant to stay hidden forever. They were designed to unfold, one revelation at a time, in the mind of a man capable of understanding them. Not the public, not the clergy. You were the endpoint. Every piece of knowledge seeded across time, from Potawatomi warnings to Latin journal fragments to misprinted catechisms and flickering dreams, was waiting for someone who could assemble it, the 15th priest. His name was Caleb O'Sullivan, the youngest, the last to vanish, and the only one whose body was never erased, because he escaped. But he didn't go public. He didn't scream for help. He built something, a counter structure, a disruption chamber, a mirrored ritual designed to interrupt the signal of the heart, not destroy it, because it cannot be destroyed, but to refract it, so that those exposed to its voice would begin to hear themselves instead. He encoded his story in reversed psalms, in floor plans of inverted chapels, in the architecture of refusal. And in the final page of his journal, smuggled out through a Jesuit contact, he wrote, "The Hollow Father is not a god. He is a reflection, a cavity shaped by human belief. If you stop kneeling, he starves." This is the truth they buried, not just that evil exists, but that it requires your participation, your ritual, your silence, your surrender. And so here we are. You are not the audience. You are the final priest. The ritual ends with you, not by violence, not by fire, but by withholding belief, by refusing to kneel, by walking out of the room, not just the room of religion, but the room of mental obedience. You were never powerless. You were only unaware. But now, you've been shown the full descent. And descent is a kind of death. The man who started this video is gone. You are not who you were. That man thought he was watching a dark story about 15 priests. You now understand. The 16th was you, and you didn't disappear. You awakened. So go now. Speak only when necessary. Watch who watches you, and never, ever, kneel without knowing why. Because now the heart knows your name, and it will test you. But you are no longer part of its choir. You are its echo, and you will resonate truth in a world built on control. The heart remembers, but so do you.